This film is not about a surprise. Before December 7th, 1941, the United States expected war in the Pacific. Information existed. Warnings were issued. Assessments were made. What failed was not awareness. What failed was interpretation. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the United States Pacific Fleet lay at anchor at Pearl Harbor. Battleships were moored in fixed positions along Battleship Row. Aircraft were parked in dense formations on airfields across Oahu. Anti-aircraft ammunition was secured. Radar coverage was limited. The fleet was not at battle stations. At 7:48 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft began its attack. Within minutes, torpedoes struck the harbor. Bombs fell on anchored ships. Airfields were hit almost simultaneously. The attack was concentrated, coordinated, and methodical. The battleship Arizona was hit forward. An internal explosion followed. The ship sank within minutes. More than 1,000 crewmen were killed. Oklahoma capsized after multiple torpedo strikes. West Virginia and California settled into the harbor mud. Nevada attempted to get underway, then was forced to ground. By mid-morning, 8 American battleships had been damaged. 4 were sunk. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed, most before they could take off. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. Over 1,100 were wounded. The Pacific Fleet had not been destroyed, but it had been neutralized. Operational command was disrupted. Communications were fragmented. Damage control was improvised under fire. Within hours, the scale of the disaster was clear. At higher command levels, the first assessments began immediately. They focused on surprise, on shock, on the impossibility of anticipation. Reports described an attack that could not have been expected, an enemy action that appeared unprecedented. That explanation spread quickly. It framed the event as unavoidable. It reduced the failure to timing. It implied that no reasonable preparation could have altered the outcome. But this explanation did not originate after the attack. It already existed before it. The collapse at Pearl Harbor did not begin with bombs and torpedoes. It began with how risk had been defined, with how threats had been ranked, and with what American commanders believed an enemy would and would not attempt. That belief system shaped the fleet's posture on December 7th, and it collapsed with it. In the hours following the attack, American commanders moved quickly to explain what had happened. The explanations did not emerge after defeat. They emerged while the crisis was still unfolding. They were formed under pressure, with incomplete information, and within an institutional framework that already existed. The dominant conclusion was simple. The attack had been a surprise, a bolt from the blue, an action that no reasonable commander could have anticipated. That explanation aligned with existing doctrine. It aligned with expectations about how wars began, and it aligned with assumptions about Japanese capabilities. It was accepted quickly, and once accepted, it became difficult to challenge. The explanation did not remain provisional. It hardened quickly. The belief in surprise became certainty, and certainty shaped decisions. Resources were allocated accordingly. Defensive priorities were adjusted. Attention shifted away from Hawaii. The threat was now understood as distant, as external, as something that would appear elsewhere first. That conclusion simplified planning. It reduced uncertainty, and it reinforced existing assumptions about how the enemy would act. Within command structures, the question was no longer whether the attack could have been foreseen. The question became where the next one would fall. Not all assessments aligned with the new certainty. Warnings existed. They were specific, and they challenged the prevailing conclusion. Some officers questioned whether distance alone guaranteed safety. Others noted changes in enemy capability. Carrier aviation, range, and coordination were no longer theoretical. These warnings did not come too late. They arrived while decisions were still being made, but they conflicted with what leadership believed it had already learned. They complicated planning, they introduced doubt, and they demanded reconsideration under pressure. In a system moving toward clarity, disruptive warnings were treated as noise. They were acknowledged, they were filed, and they were set aside. The new certainty was not tested immediately. There was no single moment that forced reconsideration, no decisive engagement that demanded revision. Instead, events unfolded gradually. Japanese operations moved outward. Targets appeared where they had been expected, southward, toward areas already identified as vulnerable. For American commanders, this seemed to confirm the conclusion. The enemy was acting as predicted. The threat was behaving as anticipated. Each operation reinforced the belief that Pearl Harbor had been an exception, a singular event, not a model for future action. The test, when it came, did not arrive as a warning. It arrived as confirmation. The first signs of failure did not appear dramatic. They appeared as inconsistencies. Enemy operations began to diverge from expectation. Timelines shifted, targets expanded, methods adapted. Carrier-based strikes demonstrated reach and coordination that exceeded earlier assumptions. What had been treated as exceptional began to appear repeatable. Reports reflected growing unease. Assessments became less confident. Language shifted. But no formal reversal followed. The system hesitated. The break did not arrive as collapse. It arrived as strain. Recognition did not come suddenly. It emerged through accumulation. Reports contradicted earlier assumptions. Operational outcomes failed to align with predictions. Patterns no longer fit the accepted explanation. Carrier aviation had demonstrated reach, flexibility, and coordination. Distance no longer guaranteed safety. Timing no longer defined vulnerability. Assessments changed. Language shifted from certainty to qualification, from confidence to caution, from explanation to reassessment. The failure was no longer viewed as isolated. It was understood as systemic. The consequences were not confined to Pearl Harbor. They reshaped American doctrine. They altered defensive priorities. They accelerated changes already underway. Carrier aviation moved from supporting role to central instrument. Early warning systems were expanded. Assumptions about distance, timing, and surprise were revised. But these corrections came after loss. The failure that opened the war was not tactical. It was interpretive. Warnings had existed. Information had been available. Signals had been received. What failed was not intelligence. What failed was judgment. The belief that Pearl Harbor was safe did not collapse under attack. It collapsed under evidence. That belief had shaped preparation. It had shaped readiness. And it had shaped vulnerability. Pearl Harbor was not a mystery. It was a decision, and its consequences defined the war that followed.